Hey there! I want to have a very important talk with you about the actual impact of roleq on hero shooters. Regardless of whether you play Marvel Rivals, Overwatch, Team Fortress 2, Paladins, or Battleborn, whatever it might be, this is an important subject for you to understand, and I want to preface this by saying I'm a longtime Overwatch player and now a Marvel Rivals player as well. This topic is important because it impacts you, a hero shooter player, I assume, regardless of what game you play. Whether you view this as a cautionary tale on why Marvel Rivals should absolutely never even toy with the concept of implementing roleq, or as a call to action for a reversion of Overwatch's primary format from roleq back to openq, this discussion is something I hope you'll take to heart. On the surface, the choice between roleq and openq can seem mundane. For a lot of people, it really just boils down to do you want order or freedom, which is precisely how I mapped these metrics in my format politics video, but the decision actually runs immensely deeper than that. And my current views and beliefs are structured in much larger part on the other aspects of this dynamic than just freedom and order. We'll touch on those aspects for sure, but there's a lot to cover. Before we get into it, please do like and subscribe. It genuinely helps a lot, and any help means that I get to see my precious little oink again sooner, and that means the world to me. So from the bottom of my heart, yet again, thank you so much for the support. Okay, let's get into it. Just in case anyone isn't aware, I think it's important that I outline what roleq is, as well as what openq is. openq is the system we currently have in Marvel Rivals, and what Overwatch had until 2019. It's a system where everyone pushes the exact same button when they want to play a match, and the game puts you in a match where you decide what you want to play after the fact. You're free to switch between heroes and roles at will. In the ranked mode, everyone has a rank that separates them by skill. roleq is a system where you must first choose what roles you want to play. The game finds enough players for each role individually to have a balanced match, you're unable to change your role during the match, and you have a different rank for each individual role. Honestly, on the surface, it sounds like a very simple system with only one obvious downside. And probably, for many people, this is as far as the thought process goes. But let's dive much, much deeper into how roleq harms the game and why it's a bad choice for any hero shooter. To start, I want to address the most obvious aspect of this entire thing: queue times. You probably knew this was coming, but how couldn't we talk about this? It's almost become a meme at this point that Overwatch players spend absolute years of their life watching things on YouTube and Netflix and scrolling on their phones rather than actually playing the game like Rivals players get to. This is 100% due to the implementation of roleq. Sure, a long queue time wasn't unheard of in the before times, but since roleq's implementation, not only has the average queue time increased by a massive margin, but even with massive sweeping changes to the way the game is formatted altogether, which have received an immense amount of negative criticism due to the way they affected the gameplay, they still haven't returned queue times to where they were before roleq's implementation. And that's even with the sacrifices to the quality of the matchmaker that surely had to have been made. Just to touch on that really quickly, I'm not really going to address it in this video, but just know that a massive debate has been raging within the Overwatch community for a long time now because a tank was removed from the roleq roster in order to try to alleviate some of that horrible queue time. But it made the game almost unbearable for many players, and as much as people like to attribute that to other things, it's yet another result of roleq's implementation. I don't really want to get into the more nuanced aspects of how roleq impacts meta itself, as that could be its own entire video, but suffice to know that the metas following roleq's implementation back in 2.2.2, specifically what was the best metas at the highest level in 2.2.2, were some of the most unbearable trash I have ever played in my life, and I find it hilarious that videos talking about how I don't miss Overwatch 1 always show specifically clips from this era, which is hilarious given how great things were before it. But queue time isn't a concept that lives in a vacuum. Au contraire. Queue time is actually a very finicky concept that's affected by a myriad of factors, and it's easy to alleviate long queue times if you sacrifice things that absolutely should not be sacrificed. On the inverse, however, having lower queue times means you can dedicate that queue time health towards some very, very important things. When you queue up for a match, what are the primary things the matchmaker should try to do? Well, those things are as follows. Try to find you a match with players around your skill level. Try to find balanced teams to make a fair fight. Try to find you a match on a server close to you or on your chosen server specifically. And try to find you a match as quickly as possible. Understand that these are 4 jobs the matchmaker must do simultaneously, and if any extra amount of focus or stress is put on one of these aspects, a sacrifice must be made to the others. In a perfect world, every match would consist of both teams being perfectly balanced for a really close fight, with players all at your same skill level and rank, on whatever server you have the lowest ping connection to, and with absolutely no time waiting in queue whatsoever, an instantaneous match found. Obviously this can't always happen, but getting as close as possible with those 4 metrics sounds like the perfect matchmaker, right? Well, add in a 5th aspect, finding enough players queuing specifically for each individual role, and now there's an immense amount of stress put on the system. Instead of being able to dedicate 25% of its effort to all 4 key aspects, the matchmaker now has to make sacrifices, and the best balance it can make is 20% across the board. Sure, 5% sacrifices sounds not that bad on paper, but that's out of 25 each, so you're basically getting a 20% hit to every aspect. 20% longer queue times, 20% more stomps, 20% more games with absolute cretins in ranks below you or with pros you can't keep up with, and 20% more matches on servers you have a bad connection to. Do I actually know how the matchmaker makes this split? Obviously not. These are estimations. But that sacrifice is something that is being made, and with openq, those things can be tuned to be much healthier, much easier. Personally, while it may suck to have teammates who play a comp that doesn't feel winnable, I'll take that every single day over unbalanced games, high-ping servers, wide-range matches, and long queue times. It's not even a remotely hard choice. And if you feel for even a moment that any of those are already bad with openq, imagine how much worse it would be with roleq. Again, if I had to guess, about 20% worse. And to address these comments before they happen, the reason you're getting shitty matchmaking in openq right now, if you are, regardless of which game you play, is 100% due to other factors, and would absolutely be 20% worse with roleq. In Marvel Rivals, the reason is just the matchmaking and ranked system being broken at its core. Check out my 2 videos on this topic if you're curious, but solving that issue will solve this one, while roleq would just exacerbate the problem. For Overwatch, it's because of 2 things. Partially just because roleq exists at all, but mostly because roleq is considered the real format, while openq is a side mode. Whether it be neglect from the devs, a lack of any professional presence, or the community's views reflecting this, openq struggles because it's a cursory mode, not because of anything inherent about it. It doesn't matter if people like roses or sunflowers more. If one gets watered and the other doesn't, it's obvious which one people will say is beautiful. Let's move on, however, to an aspect that not many players recognize is an aspect of this debate. Dividing the community is the absolute unhealthiest thing you can do in any game. I understand that even in Rivals, there is some animosity between the different roles. Whether it be complaining about X role on your team having no idea what they're doing, or about how duelists hold your game hostage by refusing to swap, or even making YouTube videos about how strategists are boosted. But this hatred is way, way worse in modern Overwatch, and I can easily, without a doubt in my mind, tell you why. Because it's roleq. Roleq has created a world where no player has to truly understand the other roles, even if they want to excel at their own role. Funnily enough, I was just watching some videos while pondering this topic, and I came across a video where Frito, the Your Overwatch guy, says the exact opposite. Now you know I'm right, because Frito is saying the complete opposite. Nah, I'm just kidding. Frito has been right at least twice. But I cannot fathom how he thought this would make the roles understand each other better. Maybe he thought the way Overwatch would evolve with the implementation of roleq was that players really would attempt to be the best they could on every role, but in actuality, if you look at the majority of accounts, or even just glance at combined top 500, it becomes evident what actually happened. The large majority of the player base absolutely gave up on the roles that weren't their best role. Obviously, this isn't the case for everyone, myself being top 500, and Grandmaster across the board the last time I bothered to mess with roleq, but most players have zero interest in understanding anything about what it takes to play the other roles, and this has become more evident in the way the roles treat each other. Have you ever heard the concept of ignorance breeds contempt? If that flew over your head, essentially, not understanding someone or something makes people hate that person or thing. The best way to get people to stop hating is to introduce them. It's one reason some of the biggest racists are people who have never really gotten to know someone of the race they hate. It's hard to feel anything akin to hate for an entire people when you see them as who they are, people. And as much as the stakes are way lower here, the same rule still applies. When people are forced to actually know even the slightest thing about how to play the other roles, and even given the opportunity to do so during a match, it's harder to hate each other. It's easy to say, "My healers refuse to heal me," but much easier to see their perspective when you swap support and see just how much pressure the supports are under. On the flip side, however, forced separation breeds tribalism. My favorite example to bring up is Dead by Daylight. Sure, there are a lot of great people in the Dead by Daylight community, like genuinely a lot, but I'd say for the most part, the Dead by Daylight community overall is the most toxic cesspool of hatred and villainy that I have ever had the misfortune of having to sift through. And at the heart of it, beyond the fact that the game is a veritable bully simulator, the reason for this is because the game has separated the community into two opposing sides, survivors and killers. And while a lot of players play both sides of that coin, a huge portion of the player base only dabbles in one side while absolutely maining the hell out of the other. And because of the phenomenon I described earlier about separation breeding contempt, these players have absolutely messed up views of the game and how it has to be played, specifically policing how the opposing side must play. The term Survivor Handbook wasn't coined for no reason. Players get unreasonably upset for the other role just trying to win the game. From Survivor players saying killers can't tunnel or slug, to killer players saying survivors can't body block, Dead by Daylight features slurs and death threats on the regular for just playing the game to win. Overwatch isn't nearly at this point yet, but I absolutely think a lot of the shit I see both online as well as stuff I saw in comms is in large part due to this divide. Again, it's not perfect in Rivals, but I think there's a level of understanding when everyone is in the same boat. Speaking of the same boat, I want to talk about the competitive integrity of roleq versus openq. A lot of roleqers like to say the game is more competitive with roleq forcing your team comps to be balanced, and I'm here to tell you once again that the opposite is true. First of all, do you remember earlier I mentioned that videos and discussions pop up here and there that so-and-so role is boosted and stuff like that? The only time that ever is or can be true is in roleq. That's because the three roles are not playing the same game when they queue up into roleq, or rather, they aren't on the same competitive leaderboard. While yes, you may be playing your specific match against those on the enemy team regardless of their role, what your rank comes out to meaning for each individual role is specifically about how you stack up solely against players of that same role. So while things like balance of each role and the characters within that role can fluctuate regardless of what queue type your game has, those tools are always at the disposal of everyone equally in an open queue format. Maybe a character like Cloak and Dagger takes less mechanical skill, and while I'd argue that the skilled part of playing C&D actually lies in understanding her matchups and using your game sense and positioning, the actual important thing here is that everyone has the opportunity to play her equally within the one queue and ranked ladder of Marvel Rivals. On the flip side of this, in Overwatch's role queue, maybe support is boosted at whatever given moment of the game's lifespan. And who are you to know until you throw your hat into the ring and try to climb on that role? There is absolutely nothing tying the Grandmaster rank of tank to the Grandmaster rank of support or damage, other than the fact that you are going to see each other in the same matches. So yes, these players absolutely have the ability to be boosted. In an open queue format, players may be boosted by playing with a Smurf friend or stacking with cracked teammates or by buying an account or boosting, but no one is boosted because of the role or character they play. In that regard, it's an even playing field, and anything they can do, you absolutely have the opportunity to do yourself. Moving on, I'd like to debunk some misleading arguments about role queue versus open queue. To start, I'd like to debunk the idea that role queue is more competitive, and actually argue the complete opposite. Most role queuers argue that the chaos of open queue, where players have the freedom to pick what they want, leads to a mess of damage and duelist players ruining matches by not playing what the team needs. They also complain that when people do fill into those extra roles, it's common that they perform quite poorly due to filling onto roles or characters they have absolutely no knowledge or skill on. And beyond this, they argue that a queue system where everyone chooses a role ahead of time much more accurately reflects the gameplay of an actual structured professional match. But this is a flawed and narrow-sighted way of looking at things. To start, professional hero shooter matches may often feature players who specialize in a single role. In fact, this is typically the most common type of player, but looking at things like this is a very revisionist way of looking at hero shooter history. I, for one, am really tired of flex player erasure. Yes, the fourth type of professional player has always been a staple of this genre, and that's the player on your team who has expertise on whatever role the situation calls for. Whether you need some extra damage, an extra tank, or more healing, flex pros and even just flex players have been honing a skill set that encompasses all three usual roles in an avatar-like synergy between all three communities. But that's just one of the aforementioned arguments. What about matches where everyone's just picking damage and duelist, forcing you either onto a role you don't know and didn't want to play, or just into an unwinnable match? To start, hero shooters have always featured unwinnable matches. As much as it's hard to come to terms with it, hero shooters are a team genre, and there's no use in pretending you can save every single match, regardless of what roles your team has. Having an unorthodox team comp, however, may not be what's barring you from winning that match. While players may be more accustomed to something akin to a 2-2-2, the thing that may be throwing your games is your mentality. I know others will deny this, but I still stand by games in this genre being much more about how you play rather than what you play. And I think you'll find that if you don't tilt in games with an unorthodox comp, you may end up winning some matches you didn't expect to. Now, there is something to be said for the ranked system testing the depth of your hero pool, and we'll touch on that momentarily. But the last aspect of this I want to debunk is the idea that players are terrible at the roles they fill into. Do you know what the answer to this is? It's simply to just play what you're good at. I understand it may be tempting to play the perfect character or even the perfect role for your team's comp, but the healthiest thing you can do for your own ranked career is to be honest about your hero pool. If you think you need a Doctor Strange or a Reinhardt, or whatever it might be, if that hero is not something you're comfortable with, Don't fill onto it. Fill only within your hero pool. And you may be saying, it's not me, it's my brain-dead teammates not playing what they're good at. You'd be astonished what using your words can do. If things aren't going well, try asking your team to go your mains. You'd be surprised how willing players are to swap onto their main, and how much better of a chance you'll have at winning when your team does. Sure, they might suck, but they're at the same rank as you for a reason. Hopefully that reason isn't just number of matches played. I'm not done with this topic, however, because people tout this as one of the strongest arguments for roleq. Big figures in the hero shooter space, like Flats, CarQ, Spylo, and even Frito, have basically expressed the sentiment that the quality of the game goes down when players are forced onto roles they aren't actually at their highest level on during their ranked matches, which ends up losing them games, and even have gone as far as to say that roleq is a higher skill experience that's generally harder because you are no longer held back by aforementioned filling. And everyone in those games is skilled at what they're playing, so there's less room for error and lack of skill. But I think it's a massively biased and short-sighted way of looking at things. Yes, you do 100% have to only focus on honing your individual role in roleq, but I think that not being true of openq is part of what makes it great, alongside a completely different expression of skill. In openq, the matchmaker is testing your hero pool and understanding of the game overall more deeply, as well as testing your understanding of yourself. So if you aren't good at a character you think your team needs, and yet you don't understand yourself well enough to recognize that, you should get punished. On the flip side, I don't understand why someone who's great at two different roles should get punished by not being able to utilize their full skill set during the match. Do you see the difference between these two dynamics? Yes, they are kinda just a matter of opinion of what you want the matchmaker to test, but one system has no punishment for a lack of understanding and skill, while the other fully tests your skill set and understanding of the game. To me, that feels like a clearly obvious reason to favor openq's assessment of skill over roleq's. But if the logic of that isn't good enough for you, let me get a bit anecdotal. While roleqers argue that the game is harder and of higher general skill in roleq, I think the opposite is much more evidently true. openq players can do what roleq players do best, but not vice versa. The reason for this is that openq players have always been playing roles, just like roleqers, so for them it's barely different, just more restrictive, and they understand all three roles much more often. Roleq players, however, are much more likely to fumble if forced into an openq setting. Where is my evidence that openq players understand roleq so well? Have you heard of a single Overwatch Pro or top 500 player who became washed after roleq was implemented? Because I personally haven't, and as a former openq top 500, back when top 500 wasn't literally diamond, I have had the easiest time in the world getting to the highest level on every role. roleq is easy and certainly not more skilled. On the topic of picks making games harder, and even the flip side of people trying to police your picks in order to make a good comp, while many say these are both larger problems with openq, roleq does not solve either of these whatsoever. If I've learned anything in my years of playing hero shooters, it's that no matter how much freedom you have and what character you pick, even if there were only 2 characters in the whole game, there will always be some guy to tell you you're on the wrong hero and that's why your team is losing. Alongside this, again, even if there was so little freedom that you were stuck on one role with only a choice between 2 heroes, there would still be a meta with one of those heroes being stronger. And if history is anything to go by, that meta would still be less important typically than your own individual hero pool. roleq alleviates neither of these, and hurts the game in drastic ways at the same time. Moving on, what would you say if I told you that Marvel Rivals currently being more popular than Overwatch was proof that openq is objectively better than roleq? My hope is that you would see this as incredibly flawed logic, because there are a myriad of factors that play into the popularity of both of these games, beyond just that one's primary mode is roleq while the other's is openq. For whatever reason, however, this fallacious logic is the exact same logic I see openq haters use when anyone mentions openq being better for Overwatch than roleq. Now, it's obvious to see in this scenario that there are certainly more differences between two entirely different games than there are between two modes within the same game, but just because an example is exaggerated doesn't mean the same rule doesn't apply. Roleqers say, "Look how nobody plays openq Overwatch, it's because Overwatch players don't like it," despite the fact that openq Overwatch is incredibly neglected and unbalanced. There hasn't been a single patch targeted at openq since roleq's inception until now. It has never been the format of a professional tournament or league since roleq's implementation, and an entire role has been virtually unviable within it due to the aforementioned lack of any balance attempts whatsoever. What's worse, the Overwatch devs have put immensely more effort into a test 6v6 quick play mode than they ever did toward the literal competitive queue for openq, which is seen between 1 and 0 changes depending if you count the 150 HP nerf to all tanks at the start of Overwatch 2. Not only this, but even with most attention being on roleq, openq still has a following, despite being so neglected. If anyone wants to pretend that this lack of attention is due to the queue type itself, and that there just isn't a player base for it, I find it much easier to imagine that Rivals' success is due to it having an open format. But in all fairness, I think we can toss out both of these viewpoints as just preposterous. I think at the very least, you'd be astonished by how much player perception and even playtime would change if Overwatch's openq was both made the format for professional play, alongside being the bigger button on the left rather than the small, insignificant one on the right. I think it's time to address the elephant in the room, the obvious difference between these two. And I again think this is heavily in openq's favor. Order versus freedom. I think the big appeal of hero shooters has always been something really hard to put your finger on. It's the way the character or characters you like speak to you. It's the way all of the abilities interact. It's about the insane moments you create in your own individual matches. It's something akin to feeling like a hero, thus the hero shooter moniker. And while I do think ascribing requirements to a game just indicative of a silly name we give to a genre is stupid, like I talked about in my first ever YouTube video, there is truth in the magic of the genre being found there. And that's where I think freedom and openq absolutely trump the opposition. You don't come to a game like this to be locked into a one-dimensional scenario you didn't get to dictate. Whether you're a one-trick backline diver, or you specialize in being exactly what your team needs in every individual moment, I think the beauty of these games is fully realized when you choose who you are, and don't feel trapped on whatever role you decided to queue up for. Alongside this, being able to utilize your entire skill set to address problems feels immensely better than having to beg your teammates to do it. I'll always come back to this example, but begging a teammate to swap Cassidy in order to shoot down the Pharah is a way worse experience than just swapping to Hela yourself and immediately shooting the Iron Man out of the sky yourself. And even if that individual example doesn't apply to you as much, it certainly doesn't when you have aim like mine, there are numerous examples that could. For me, maybe it's that I was gonna play Cloak and Dagger, but I see that my tank is struggling, so I decide to tank alongside him. Or we really genuinely just can't get any kills, so I swap Wanda and show the lobby how even the lowest tiered characters can still do work in the right hands. The point is that the number of unwinnable games doesn't go up like roleqers like to say. It actually goes down, because you are given the freedom
to actively have a say in whether you win or lose your match. Player agency is one of the absolute most important aspects of what makes a game enjoyable, and stripping players of the freedom to swap is a direct attack on their agency. And while teammates can strip you of this agency in bad scenarios, the same is true regardless of the queue type. openq just gives you more say in what happens in your match, and that's a huge plus. I think the last big point about what's wrong with roleq is this: the competitive ladder just isn't competitive anymore. Listen, I know I'm good at this genre, but I don't feel comfortable waltzing onto all top 500 leaderboards so easily. While Rivals has only one leaderboard, Overwatch has 5: tank, damage, support, combined, and openq. Yes, sadly no one really cares about the last two, but we've already addressed why that is, from dev neglect to having no incentive to practice or understand weaker roles. And even the premier ones, the big 3, are way too easy to achieve. That's because it's not just the 500 best players in the world anymore, it's the 500 best players of that specific metric. The more you just chop up the community into smaller and smaller bites, the less impressive it becomes to be the best. I honestly just gave up at Grandmaster 2 on support because I got bored, but hell, in today's world that would be top 500. The problem with a roleq top 500 is that it's not top 500. It's top 1,500 or 2,500 if you want to count every leaderboard. And honestly, at that point, you have even more players than Rivals has in the Eternity rank. So who cares? One above all is cool because it's an exclusive club. Being easy to get makes the top rank worth less. And right now, that's exactly how I'd describe it. Worthless. So what now? Well, this is where you get involved. If you want to save your player agency, your freedom to choose, if you want low queue times, if you want to play on good ping servers and retain or unlock your ability to choose what server you play on, if you want balanced matches and want to play against players at your actual skill level, if you want to get into games fast rather than waiting longer than you actually play, if you want all of this, actively, vocally, fight for your game, whatever it is, to be openq. Roleq may have its minor benefits, but it sacrifices vastly too much to be good for a hero shooter. Fight for your right to have openq. Talk about it in the threads, leave comments about it on this video and others, link this video to your friends or to your discords. Fight for openq, please. I personally am not playing roleq again, regardless of what game it is. Please, please, get this video where it needs to be. Thank you all for your help.
There's actually a few more things to touch on before we go, some really important stuff, so let's move on.
I want you to take note of something. Have you noticed that almost all of my points about roleq being bad have nothing to actually do with the number of characters on your team per each individual role? That may sound confusing, but think about it for a sec, because I have a little bit of a bomb to drop. I'm not really opposed to roleq, just roleq. Now I think a much healthier discussion can be had about roleq versus openq, but the important discussion to be had is just about avoiding roleq at all costs. If you aren't aware what the differentiation I'm making is, it's between roleq, where you choose a role before the game starts, have a rank for each role individually, and are stuck on that role once you get into a game, while roleq is just a rule in the game that prevents your team from having too crazy of a team comp. What roleq looks like can vary, and Overwatch even messed around with something called min 1 max 3, a mode I really adored and think people didn't give enough of a chance, where the number of characters per role on your team could range between 1 and 3, no higher or lower, but honestly that entire debate is something you could talk about for a whole different discussion. I have no qualms with 222 itself, other than maybe in Overwatch it's specifically made for some really shitty metas. I'm looking at you, Double Shield. But roleq is genuinely not nearly as bad for the game as roleq.
Go back if you want and look at each individual argument I gave for why we should avoid roleq. One or two may apply to roleq, but not most. I could see arguments in favor of roleq versus openq and vice versa, but to me it doesn't matter as much so long as we can avoid roleq. That's the real evil. Now I want to really quickly address goats. I think a lot of players have qualms with goats, and I have good news and bad news. The bad news, to start, is that a comp like goats absolutely could pop up in Marvel Rivals. We already saw the triple support comp getting a lot of play and a lot of hate online, so clearly the precedent for such a situation is there, and I wouldn't be surprised if we run into a similar scenario one day. Alongside this, I know Overwatch players are still shell-shocked from the entire ordeal. For those who aren't aware, I'll summarize it thusly. Goats was a 3-tank, 3-support comp back in Overwatch that absolutely dominated the meta and professional play for a long time. People will tell you any 3 tanks and any 3 supports is goats, but that's bullshit. It was a specific set of 5 characters alongside 3 different characters to fill the final spot, with some variations to it that had slightly different names, and there was even times it was played with 1 damage character rather than the 3rd tank. But the big issue was that the comp absolutely dominated the competitive scene for an incredibly long time, and basically made the entire damage or duelist role unplayable to some extent. roleq may be touted today as having been for lower rank players who wanted to have less damage insta-lockers on their team, but it was absolutely 100% about goats and not this, because this was a problem Overwatch had since its inception, and it wasn't actually a real issue, while goats was hurting the game's viewership and probably high-level player base numbers. So I completely understand why Overwatch players are scared of an openq world, and why Marvel Rivals players may worry the same will come to them, but this problem is honestly overplayed to all hell, so let's address it. First of all, goats was never the meta at every rank. While some average and low rank players like to complain about it, they never actually played it right, and thus it was absolutely counterable and countered. I understand Brig herself may have caused some matches to feel absolutely one-sided, as the character was very polarizing in general, especially to a player trying to play the game the same way they might in a pre-Brig world, especially if they tried to dive her as if she was any other support. But no, the comp was only truly a thing at high rank, even if it was tried elsewhere. Now, yes, at the highest rank, in my top 500 games, it was typically goats or you lose. And while I enjoyed the ever-living hell out of the comp, and still see it as the second most fun comp Overwatch has ever seen, I can understand how the majority of the roster being unplayable, including the beloved damage role, would absolutely turn off many players to the game. But roleq wasn't what solved goats. Innovation was, alongside some hefty balance patches. Even before goats was absolutely banned via roleq being implemented, goats had become a losing comp, with damage-heavy poke comps beating it out. It seems like almost every single Overwatch player has been gaslit into thinking that goats was unstoppable and then suddenly put down by roleq, but the last stage of Overwatch League to ever purely be openq was won by comps that absolutely obliterated goats. Go watch the VOD if you don't believe me, I'll leave a link in the description. We can't keep pretending that goats was just unstoppable. The only level of play it dominated in found a way to make it look pitiful before roleq ever existed. Goats was never a problem that needed to be solved via roleq. It just needed some actual effort and thought put into fixing the problem. But as we're finding out now, Overwatch was in a desperate state behind the scenes, and every decision seemed to just breed new problems, roleq included. Even goats itself was a problem that stemmed from another solution, with Brig's addition being the final linchpin to the comp, while she was meant to be an answer to dive having been the meta for an immensely long time. And while today, goats like comps still dominated the truly openq world, pre-6v6 being added to competitive just recently, that's largely in part to tanks being absolutely busted in Overwatch 2 on purpose, while the devs have no reason to try to tackle this problem because they don't care about openq whatsoever.
Goats is not holding Overwatch back from being openq, and it wasn't back then even. They just invested so much into pulling that trigger that they basically had to, and Rivals does not need to fear a goat scenario, especially when they say they intentionally balance for the majority of the player base rather than high level. It's all about design. Honestly, there's a whole argument people make against roleq that team comps become less creative when you restrict the roles like that, but I think the more important aspect is how it affects individual players. There's also something to be said for the fact that in reality, a big part of what makes these games fun is that people play these games to play heroes they like. Whether it be the aesthetic, the kit, the skills required, the general feel, or even just the character's personality or lore, hero shooters thrive on players adoring their heroes, and most things that take away that freedom to play what you like should be avoided. While the argument could certainly be made, just queue up for the role that has the hero you like. Often players like heroes from multiple roles. I don't just like Magneto or Diva, I also like Cloak and Dagger or Lifeweaver. Whether you like and play only one character, multiple characters but all within the same role, or characters from 2 or even all 3 roles, I think the game should treat you fairly, and roleq only really panders to single role enjoyers. Especially if you do like Overwatch's 5v5 format will soon, with roleq and hero bans. So you're not allowed to be a flex player, but you're not allowed to be a one-trick either. Why would I want to play a game that's so restrictive that it's only specifically made for people who play one role but multiple heroes within that role, and for nobody else at all? Your rebuttal to this may be, oh, but openq panders to multi-role players. Isn't that just as bad? No, because it doesn't. I know single-role players often pretend like they're subjugated to having to play other roles in order to actually win their games without roleq, but that's just objectively not true. They may be forcing themselves to play roles they dislike or even aren't good at, but in actuality, players have been hitting the highest ranks of both Overwatch and Marvel Rivals without ever swapping off their preferred role, or even their one-trick character. As much as this narrative may feel easy to listen to, thinking openq forces you to fill if you want a chance to win, it's never been true, and people who think this way are tricking themselves into not understanding why they are actually losing their games. Okay, that's all friends. Thank you so much for watching the video. Please, please, please like, subscribe, join if you can, rewatch if you want, link this video to whoever you can. You really don't know how much work I put into this, especially on a long one like this, on a topic I'm really passionate about. If this flops, it will be really hard for me to make big stuff like this again. I have a lot of bills and stuff, especially given our whole immigration debacle, and even now I'm moving because the building I'm living in is getting torn down, so I have to get ready for that. I just don't have the time to commit to videos like this if they fail, but I want so badly for this to do well. So thank you, really genuinely, for all the help and support. A super big thank you to my patrons, Cammy and James, and my channel member Archduke, as well as my newest channel member, The Wiseful. Thank you so much for being here, Wiseful, and thank you to the whole lot of you for everything. Okay friends, I hope soon I'll have videos of me and Oink and Marie reunited. See you later!